Hello all. This is Bill Selecki. I'm excited to moderate this panel today. Today we're going to be talking about the new Biden administration policy with respect to infrastructure and its connection to crucial social questions such as equity and climate change. I think I want to say a few words about the framing of this panel and the kinds of things that we'd like to try to pursue. But first, I'd like to try to introduce the panelists. But before that, I want to thank Dr. Shama Venkateswar and of the Institute for Public Policy at Roosevelt House, and Peter Scafani for helping out in the development of this panel, as well as the broader Roosevelt House team. So in this panel discussion, we have a set of experts within the Hunter faculty who are going to be speaking about different questions associated with the Biden administration initiatives with respect to infrastructure, climate policy, and equity. We'll have each of the panelists speak for a few minutes, and then have a mediated conversation between the panelists, and then open it up for questions and answer session with a larger audience. I'll just very briefly introduce the three panelists. We have Bipasha Chatterjee, who is an adjunct lecturer in the Hunter Department of Economics, and also the chair of the International Advisory Board at the Coalition for Renewable Gas. She's primarily going to be speaking about the question of financing and how to sort of bring some of these questions of financing to these initiatives that have been proposed. Dr. Peter Marcotulio will be a second panelist. He's a professor of geography and environmental science, also at Hunter College, and is furthermore is the director of the Institute for Sustainable Cities at Hunter College as well. And Peter is really going to be speaking about some of the specific details of energy policy, how the Biden administration's initiative sort of connects with an ongoing question of energy policy at the federal level and the implications for global climate mitigation. And then third up in the process, we have Dr. Owen Goodfriend. He's a professor in a department at Hunter in urban policy and planning, and he's also the director of urban studies, the urban studies program here at Hunter. His particular perspective is both historical and analytical in terms of looking at policy, but particularly at the local level in the context of cities. So we really have a great sort of suite of three experts to sort of talk about different aspects of the Biden initiative with respect to public policy, some of the expectations, some of the ways in which these policies might emerge, and the implications for some of these larger questions, as I mentioned, such as equity. What I'd like to do at this point, though, is introduce a few kind of concepts, into the arena to sort of set the stage, so to speak, to get us thinking about this, and then sort of move on to the three panelists. So there'll be a couple of slides that we'll see, and maybe we can go to those just now. So I think, all of us recognize, the shift in policy that emerged with the shift in administrations in January. And of course, it was quite, well highlighted, that one of the first things that President Biden did was to sort of move into the Oval Office and start signing executive orders of one type or another. And we can talk about the significance or the capacity of executive orders, but certainly they set a tone and a direction for initiatives that any administration wants to do. Biden did many of these. It's become sort of part of that transition process, certainly within the presidency. But I think it's really critical at this stage when we think about the infrastructure plan and some of the other sort of connected questions of climate action and also equity to sort of dive into a couple of these executive orders. So in one of the ones that he signed, of the many that he signed on that first January day, was on protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis. So even that title speaks so much of the shift in agenda and the implications that brings to the question. So for example, the term climate crisis, even sort of defining it as the climate change process that's underway as a crisis in and of itself. We've also heard the term climate emergency and a range of other sorts of descriptors, but to phrase it as a climate crisis sort of brings it up at a rhetorical level, but also in the context of policy. And also this notion of restoring science and the connection between science and public policy. I mean, the 20th century and much of sort of recent history has been about how do we connect science. In fact, if you look in the modern era, the growth of science, well, whether in the environmental realm, whether it's involved in public health or water supply or a range of other topics, it is the emergence or increasing agricultural production. It's the growth of science and its translation into public policy. And so one of the things that Biden stated very explicitly, it was to make that connection between science and policy to the extent to which, if you see in the upper right corner of this screen, that's a portrait of Benjamin Franklin, an archetype of science, right? And so he very consciously removed the portrait of Andrew Jackson, which was there under the previous administration, and replaced it with Benjamin Franklin, who's been obviously connected to the question of science and translating that into policy. But there are many other things that sort of came on that in that statement, in that and obviously a range of very high profile actions to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement process. And that was sort of like where we as quote unquote the United States would be back in, right? And so that was a statement embedded in that. But there are a range of other things that sort of spoke to different constituent groups, such as the closing of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge in the North Slope of Alaska, to once again to drilling and to natural gas exploration, illustrative of a shift in policy. And then revoking the Keystone XL pipeline, connecting Canada to the United States. Again, very symbolic as well as very sort of significant in terms of infrastructure, a shift in policy there. And then also moving up this whole notion of the social cost of carbon. How much is it going to cost? What are the implications of our actions with respect to carbon emissions, and how to sort of weave that into federal policy? So there's a lot of symbolic statements in that first executive order. There was another one that followed just a week later on January 27th, which actually got to the real grist, the beginning sort of flowering of what we could understand as the Biden policy initiatives with respect to climate. And it really sort of was formulated around two simple statements. One is that climate was going to be deeply embedded in all foreign policy that the United States articulates, to the point where they designated a special envoy for climate, a new policy position. And this, of course, is John Kerry. And so he is the one who's been literally sort of checkerboarding around the globe, sometimes virtually, sometimes in real terms, with policymakers to define and help sort of foster enhanced action on climate. And in fact, tomorrow, Biden is going to be putting together a whole, a leaders summit on climate, in which each of the countries will bring forward new national declared reductions in emissions, NDCs, commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's bated breath out there about like, what is the US number going to be? What are they going to put forward? How much closer are we going to get to these climate goals? But that is tomorrow. So that's embedded in that first climate policy. There was also within that sort of international policy perspective, there was an ambition to develop a finance plan to assist in climate action internationally. And again, that's another sort of major piece of initiative. I think Bipasha will be speaking, or at least potentially sort of touching on those points, moving forward. And all federal agencies will be involved. Anyone involved in sort of international connections, this was a sort of a starting point. And then the second element is that all federal agencies domestically, who are involved domestically, will be involved in climate action, and that here in this case, there was going to be a domestic policy czar or sort of policy a national climate advisor, Gina McCarthy, who was a former head of EPA under Obama. And so she is going to head up and is heading up the Office of Climate Policy within the executive branch. Again, something kind of a new initiative, and through that create a national climate task force to use all the force of the federal government, its purchasing power, its land management decision strategies to affect enhanced opportunities for climate change. So things like, requiring carbon-free vehicles and carbon-free electricity use by 2035, 14 years from today. But also started to speak to some of these other issues, which comes up later in his infrastructure statements about empowering workers and communities with new technology and spurring environmental justice and enhancing economic opportunities. So this January 27 executive order really spoke to some of the breadth and depth of how climate policy was going to be embedded in this new administration, at least from the very start. So maybe we can go to the next slide. So one of the things, the target or sort of the audience that all this is speaking to is a sort of larger Paris Agreement umbrella about trying to get below 2 degrees warming and toward 1.5 degrees of warming. Currently, the world has warmed about 1 degree Celsius of warming since the latter part of the 19th century. And given the current increasing levels of carbon emissions, we're probably going to be reaching that 1.5 degree mark somewhere just after the 2040s, maybe a little bit before, maybe a little bit after, but certainly, well within the next couple of decades. And most critically, it's recognized that this decade, the 2020s, is the moment to really start making effective action if we're going to reach these, climate goals. So if we can go to the next slide, what was stated in that report by the IPCC about 1.5 degrees and how to potentially achieve it, there was a recognition that there were a range of different pathways, potential ways of getting to that point. And I think one of the things that, I'm not going to go through the details of this kind of graphic, but as you run your eyes from left to right on the screen, you see P1, P2, P3, and P4. These are stylized pathways that illustrate ways in which we can get to that goal. I think a critical thing to recognize is that we have much of the technology, we have a lot of the other sort of apparatus, so to speak, to achieve these goals. One of the biggest challenges, of course, so there are several actually: financing, institutions or governance, and then of course sort of social will and tradition, so to speak. But many other stuff is available. But if you look from left to right, and again, I'm not going to go through all the details of each one of these sort of scenarios, but on the from the left, you see basically a very strict conservation condition where we reduce energy emissions, energy use, particularly in the global north, and we make some subtle but very meaningful and effective and timely transitions to low carbon energy systems and the like. As we move to the right side of the screen to pathway 4, what comes up here is really an expectation that emissions will increase, and that we'll have to implement much more abrupt, much more radical, quote unquote, in a sense of like extensive and impactful sets of infrastructure to either reduce carbon emissions or capture carbon from the atmosphere, some of which that technology has not fully been proven to operate at scale. And the crucial thing to sort of think about with any one of these pathways are the equitable considerations or issues of equity. Who is going to benefit? Who is going to lose? And how do those play out across these different spectrums? And I think the thing to keep in mind here is that all of them require significant governance and coordination and sort of action on our part. So let me go to the last set of slides, the last slide as intro. This is sort of the, I'm sorry, go back, please. I'll just one more back, I apologize. Perfect. So I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction into the infrastructure plan that President Biden put forward in March of this year, March 31st, just a few weeks ago. And really what was embedded in that was not only things to sort of enhance infrastructure, but a range of other things that sort of were designed to promote climate action. And I've just highlighted a few of these here and the dollar amounts in billions that you can see. There was also a lot focused on equity. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And then also a lot on the context of jobs and job creation. And I think it's very clear if you look at the essence of the Biden plan, what's really sort of underpinning it is this notion of reimagining this sort of relationship between government and economic development and job creation, and in some ways societal change, and sort of moving the country forward. And I think it's important to sort of reflect on that for a moment and sort of think about the implications of the Biden initiative, particularly in the context of Roosevelt House, because in some ways it's quite a significant statement and sort of illustrates sort of the broad thinking that it's really much embedded in the presidency and really kind of resonated in the era of FDR. And in some ways, this initiative and plan has that sort of broad stroke approach to hitting many, many aspects of society. Next slide, please. So I just want to briefly then close here with a couple of framing general questions that you can derive from this intro, but also as a segue to the panelist conversations. So one of the things to keep in mind is this issue of how do we link infrastructure development in the context of climate change with issues of equity. So what are some of those key challenges and opportunities that the Biden administration is trying to already identify, but also kind of connect with in the future? And then sort of moving from that, it's this issue of speed. So issue 2 is that this is going to require concerted, focused, and very kind of syncopated action during this decade. And the question is, can we sort of...
Seems like maybe we lost Bill there. So why don't we jump into each individual panelist with their introductory remarks. And I believe we're starting with Bipasha. So Bipasha, you're on. But you're muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Okay, we'll wait for Bill to join later. I'm Bipasha Chatterjee, and thank you to Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute for inviting me to speak today. Quickly, my background has been that I in the past have been a public sector consultant in EU and UK, advising on climate change policies in early years of Kyoto Protocol. And then I have been teaching in Hunter College since 2014, environmental economics and urban economics. I have also taught executive education programs at Columbia University's Earth Institute. And currently, as Bill said, I also chair the International Advisory Committee for the North America Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas, meaning waste to energy technologies. So given that kind of a background, my expertise has been mainly in the area of measuring additionality, meaning that it's not just emission reduction in a business as usual scenario. In a business as usual scenario, quite often companies and industries and sectors do move towards sustainable technologies because it's more efficient to do so. But that does not necessarily mean that we achieve the level or scale of emission reduction that is required for the planet to have a tolerable environment for a human entity and entity of other living things on this planet. So, for example, the digital revolution has been, under a business as usual scenario. It's a sustainable digital revolution that has happened. However, that has not necessarily helped in achieving the 1.5 degrees centigrade scenario that we are looking to achieve. So additionality is an important idea. And today, what I would like to do is talk about how Biden's infrastructure plan is significantly different from the past recovery plans that we have seen in the US, because it actually addresses that additionality issue through laying out not just an idea as to how we can develop better infrastructure, but mainstreaming the climate agenda in that infrastructure plan and ensuring that the infrastructure development will lead to significant change in the way we do our economic activities. So I would like to quickly share, I think, a screen. So Biden's infrastructure plan, as Bill kind of elaborated through his slides, focuses on several sectors, as you saw. And he has committed, a huge amount of finance for it. However, is that enough for the kind of ambition that plan puts forward? Now, the issue is that to achieve that additionality in terms of finance and emission reduction, we need more than what he has committed to. And his administration knows that. However, that recovery plan or the infrastructure plan or the American jobs plan, in whichever way you describe it, it basically is designed in a way which will invest in infrastructure, but incentivize and energize the private sector to unleash more finance for green infrastructure development in the US. And that's what I'm going to focus on, how I see this particular plan having that kind of a energizing element, which I really appreciate. So what is green finance? Green finance can come in many forms. Green finance is basically finance that is targeted towards projects or processes or development path that does not harm the environment. That's the first principle. Second, it enhances the quality of environment. And thirdly, it ensures that environmental damages don't have impact on the communities which suffer the most from climate change impacts. So there are many elements to that kind of financing. Now, green finance can take many forms. One of it is, of course, public finance, which Biden administration has promised $2 trillion or more towards direct investment in building roads and bridges and schools and hospitals, renewable energy infrastructure, ICT infrastructure, etc. So that's kind of direct public financing. And all these kind of financing schemes that he has proposed has the element of ensuring that infrastructure is green and climate aligned. However, there are other forms of green financing as well, such as green loans, that can come from the government as well as the private sector. Now, we have seen in last few weeks that Biden has selected people to run these kind of programs in his administration. One of them being a director of the loan program at Department of Energy. And Jigar Shah, director of the loan program, used to be the founder of SunEdison. So he is a person who has the expertise of understanding project level requirements, how project developers need low interest loans or certain kind of loans to start in projects which are climate aligned. So what I'm trying to notice or trying to observe is the kind of people that Biden administration has chosen. They are people with very deep understanding of how to unleash the energy from the private sector to help with the infrastructure plan that Biden has. The third area where there is going to be a big growth, we predict, is green bonds. So green bonds are basically ways in which the government, the corporates, the banks, municipalities, they raise or they borrow money from the private sector. And that way the private sector finance gets unleashed into projects which will mitigate climate change, which will help in adaptation to climate change. So this particular slide is showing the path for private finance flow through green bonds that will be issued by local governments, even by federal government, corporations, banks, etc. Now, with the announcement of the plan, infrastructure plan, we have already started to see some movement in the US in this green financing space, which I have been following very closely, and I wanted to share that understanding. So if you look at the left-hand column, that's basically all those investors who are the players in the insurance sector. That sector has been very passive as far as climate-aligned investment is concerned. That particular sector has a huge amount of finance in their hand, which they are ready to invest. Even in 2020, during the pandemic, we see that they were sitting with $4.5 trillion investment assets, meaning that that amount can be redirected towards investment in green infrastructure plan that Biden wants to build for the US. Now, is there any movement in that area? Well, in last few weeks, we have seen for the first time, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners have set up their climate task force, and they are trying to create different kind of directives and regulatory ideas that would influence the US insurers to redirect or unleash the investment funds that they are sitting with. The greater movement we see right now with the announcement of the infrastructure plan is in the pension fund area. So US has a huge amount of private finance in the hands of the US pension funds. I'll give you an indication as to what the number looks like. The global pension fund right now has an investment amount of $52.5 trillion. And out of that, 62% of investment asset belongs to US pension funds. So that's the amount of money they have, and they invest in infrastructure projects. However, they are not necessarily green investments. And there is a big movement here in this second column where asset managers, I've given some examples, those who are leading in this area right now, like BlackRock and PIMCO, et cetera, who manage the wealth of these pension funds. They are influencing the pension funds as well as the companies in which the funds are invested to disclose information about climate risk of their portfolio, meaning that the kind of portfolios that the companies into which these asset managers are investing in, those companies have brown portfolios which harm the environment. They have green portfolios which help the environment, but they need to disclose very in a transparent manner the balance in their portfolio and how they're trying to move away from the brown projects to greener projects. That kind of disclosure pressure is coming from the asset managers on the company in which they have equity. And those asset managers are also influencers because they are basically diverting the pension funds towards those companies. So there is a big movement here we see right now. And also there is other smaller endowments. It's not small, it's actually pretty big in the US, but compared to these other two columns, there are university endowments, There are family offices who are completely unregulated, and they need to be also brought into that kind of financing space. So who are the influencers and what kind of regulations can bring all these parties to put in their or divert their financing towards greener infrastructure investment? Well, if you look at the infrastructure platform where projects are going to be coming up, such as the digital infrastructure, real estate, water, transport, food and agriculture, power utilities, these are the sectors that Biden is talking about. This is the list that Bill put out for you. So these sectors need money to make that kind of huge transformation in their infrastructure. Some amount will come from the government, but most of the amount will come from raising funds from the private sector, either through green bonds or other means. And that's why I call them the green bonds issuers universe. And this particular sector can tap into all these pillars that I just now showed to get their finances. The banks play a huge role in designing these kind of issuances, in finding the right kind of investors for these kind of infrastructure sectors. And thereby, right now, there is a big movement within the banks whereby they're setting up new expert teams to understand how do they figure out which projects are aligned towards that 1.5 degree centigrade target, which projects are truly green, which projects are not greenwashing. They are training themselves by hiring third parties or by engaging with academic sector. So the banks are, again, getting very involved in this space. So now you can, ask me easily that what can Biden administration do to ensure that that momentum that is there in the private sector for redirecting financing towards this kind of green infrastructure development in the US, what can the government do right now to ensure that momentum stays and grows? So what I have been observing that there is some movement again in last few weeks in the Treasury through their Financial Stability Oversight Committee. They're trying to, again, think of directives and regulation that can influence the financial sector to take more proactive actions. There is also the Federal Reserve, which very excites me a lot because I've never seen central banks getting engaged in these kind of policy matters, but Federal Reserve has joined the network of central banks in the world to figure out how they can take a position about their own portfolios, about how much of green bond will be there in their own portfolios, how they would align their policies towards achieving that 1.5 degree centigrade target. So we are seeing new people employed in these roles, new climate task force being set at the treasuries and Federal Reserves. So all that movement is very new. It's literally last few weeks have been all about these kind of actions. So there is a lot of excitement in my view. Now, I wanted to now let you know about what is the view of the private sector in this regard.
Bipasha, I just want to give you a time check. I
Okay,
apologize.
right.
Yeah, you're
Yeah, so
there's so much in this space, and we're all very excited to talk.
Yes.
So maybe if you can
So-
just conclude quickly.
yes, that's
Thank
the
you.
last slide, in fact. Yeah, that was the last slide. Great. So what is the private sector's, demand or requirement from the Biden government in helping them to organize their finance towards the infrastructure plan that Biden has put out? So that is a very interesting area. I would like to conclude here because we can always come back to this point, when we discuss as to what we have found, as a need of the time, right?
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Bipasha. I mean, we're all so excited as a panel to sort of like bring forward. And as you just said, there's so much going on. So let's bring on our next Peter Marcatilio, who will be talking more about energy policy questions. And again, Peter will be bugging you if you go over as well. So I apologize.
Okay, so just as some context, Bill. So I'm gonna answer the first question, or how would you like this done? Like all the questions together?
I think what you want to think about is how you feel is most relevant. I mean, again, given the
Okay,
context of that, it's such a dynamic space that we're operating in.
right,
If you
right.
just want to give us just your first cut, like how to address even one of those questions as a start, and then we could go on to Owen. So
Okay,
maybe that's the way to think
that
about it.
right. I think Bipasha gave us a really sort of deep dive into, where finance is going and the potential for this massive infrastructure project to happen. Um, So what I will try to address then is the question of speed. For example, how one of the questions that our moderator asked us was just how fast do we think this transition to a cleaner, less fossil fuel oriented energy system can happen. And that's because I'm focusing on energy. That's what I'll emphasize. Um, and that is an excellent question. Unfortunately, the historical record isn't as, let's say, optimistic as people, as contemporary sort of observers are in terms of the possibilities. Um, if you look carefully at the history of societal transitions and particularly energy transitions, they occur at certainly at multiple time scales. The more significant they are, typically the longer they occur, or the longer time it takes for a completion of a transition. Um, there's a number of factors, obviously, that will control for this. Um, Certainly, there's technology, and there's social demands, and there's the state of development in the society, et cetera, et cetera. Um, there have been transitions that have been fairly rapid. So, for example, the horse-drawn omnibus carriages on tracks shifted to electric traction in a fairly rapid period of time. Somewhere between 1880 and 1910, there was this massive shift over. This was with the introduction and development and implementation of electricity across cities in the US as well as across the world. You'll see examples of electric traction in places like Bangkok and Jakarta, even at that early time. Manila also. However, this example is sort of the anomaly. Subsequently, traction sort of fell out of use as it was overwhelmed by personal mobility and basically the passenger vehicle, which was almost a simultaneous trend that occurred with traction. And but although the advancing of the automobile overtaking a lot of this took much longer than, let's say, 20 years. There's a number of theories that attempt to explain the timing of these transitions. Some theories sort of emphasize that it's all related to the social context and people's behavior. If something's more convenient, if provides more comfort at very low cost, certainly things will happen. And I think there's been a lot of popular books written on this that suggest that these transitions are driven by sort of personal choice and convenience and that kind of thing. In that case, when you think about renewables, there's really nothing that's more convenient about a renewable generated electricity system than a fossil fuel generated energy system. They both generate electricity. Other theories talk about tipping points, like these tipping points in dissatisfaction or certain states where things reach a certain condition, and then people, social systems, just say, "Well, we have to change," and that these systems are driven to these points where they become essentially new states. There's been a lot of work written about this in terms of, that came out of the ecological literature that also apply, or they attempted to apply to social systems. That's potentially a good way to understand this, or understand how transitions occur. Whether we reach that tipping point or not is an open question, and things remain unclear. Finally, others, of course, among a set of theories, the ones I would point out now, next are those transitions that are driven as societies tend to solve the problems that have emerged from yesterday's solutions. So, for example, we can turn back to the automobile, which was actually a solution to pollution in the streets from horses. And essentially, some historians have argued that that's social engineers at the time were suggesting that, well, look, automobiles don't have emissions, horses do. They are actually a better solution. They're more healthy. Horses die. So obviously they didn't at the time understand the impact of that new technology that was considered much more insidious. So the question then becomes, does Biden's plan provide for opportunities under these sort of different viewpoints to create the transition for cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable, potentially more equitable energy generation, provision, and use? This is obviously one of the key questions for understanding of this transition and projecting, if you will, whether this will be successful or not. I would argue that because of Biden's inclusion of certainly infrastructure, but also because he included other social issues in terms of, addressing housing, addressing jobs, addressing these other social needs, as well as his emphasis on governance and the role of government in terms of, for example, leveling the playing field, which would hopefully remove some subsidies from some big players like the fossil fuels, that there is a potential that this can at least begin to drive a transition towards a sort of greener and more equitable future for the U.S. Certainly, we can't ignore the role of government in any of this. I know that there's a lot of sort of emphasis on quote unquote free markets and other sort of government hands-off, but I certainly believe that government plays a significant role and governance plays a significant role in all of this, which hopefully we'll get to discuss it in the next round. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Peter. That, again, we sort of, with each panelist, we sort of bring in different sort of perspectives, kind of layering a set of questions. So now we'll move to our last panelist to sort of bring forth other layers. Owen Goodfriend, please.
Okay. Boy, I really, the gears are turning about both what Bipasha said and what Peter said. And I'm going to throw out not only additional layers, but some of the things I'm going to throw out here might conflict with some of what you heard in some overlapping ways to hopefully provoke some good conversation. I'm talking to you today wearing two different hats. One is as an historian that wrote a book about how the US adapted to the automobile and policies related to transportation and energy use and land use as a result of that transportation revolution. And then the other hat that I'm wearing that I'm going to talk to you about today is as a professor of planning and policy and looking at some of the details and the important details of this current infrastructure proposal. So first, as an historian, we've had some references. Peter was talking about the transitions between different modes of transportation. What I want to do is situate the current crisis and the current opportunity and compare it a little bit to roughly 100 years ago, when there was a notable significant failure of the status quo. And I'm not talking about the Depression, although the Depression provided the political will to create change at that time. I'm talking about in the years leading up to the Depression, there was an obvious both market failure and policy governmental failure to provide adequate infrastructure in three key areas. When I say adequate, I mean sufficient and fair. The three areas that I want to focus on, which relate to what we're talking about today: housing, and I don't just mean which type of housing, but also where it's located and its implications for lifestyle. Housing, transportation, and energy. The solutions that were implemented 100 years ago to address those three crises, the housing crisis, the transportation infrastructure crisis, and a transition to a whole different kind of energy pattern, those solutions from 100 years ago turned out to undermine environmental sustainability. And actually, more than that, they not only undermine sustainability, they've been active contributors to climate change. So what were the previous solutions of the previous century are the problems of today. All three involved, and this is where the spatial dimension is really important here, all three involved building infrastructure and investing infrastructure where very few people lived, with money collected from very highly populated areas. And that's a sustainability problem, because population density is a core part of the recipe for ongoing sustainability. And we were literally sucking money out of densely settled places to build infrastructures to support dispersal of people, dispersal of capital, and dispersal of activity. So housing, very briefly, that was a policy of cities are crowded and the free market, and I'm going to put free in quotes there, the market as it existed, which had a minimal government intervention, was producing only horribly substandard and inequitable housing in cities. And so the idea was we can produce better housing if we give everybody access to single family suburban homes. Everybody, again, needs to be in quotes because some people did not have access. But the idea, the philosophy behind it was, let's get everybody dispersed out into the suburbs where everybody has space in a single family home. And that started in the 20s. It started before the Depression, but the Depression kicked that into high gear with new housing policies, including the kinds of government interventions into the loan market that Bipasha is talking about, with mortgage subsidies for certain types of housing to attract private capital to support what was the policy objective at the time, getting people spread out. So that's the abbreviated version of the housing policy. Transportation, the one thing I would say in response to the way Peter framed it is that the choice for the automobile was influenced by policies that made that the more attractive choice in the US. So the transition to the automobile happened much faster in the US than in other countries. And that's partially because we, as a socialized endeavor, built the transportation infrastructure for cars, but expected transit to still occupy a business model that had to cover its own costs. And that included not only government funding of the infrastructure, but also deliberately undertaxing the per mile use of highways, very, very low gas taxes relative to every place else in the world, for example. So the choice about which mode to use and how much to use it was pushing people towards using cars and pushing people towards using them more. The more you drove a car, the more subsidy you could absorb from the government. But if you were going to ride transit, you had to pay your own way entirely. And that affected the personal preference, which amalgamated into a societal decision. Energy, there's some people here that know a lot more about energy than I do, but what I will say is this transportation mode piece had an obvious impact on energy use because the private automobile consumes so much more energy than various collective forms of transport. Also, by getting everybody more spread out across the countryside, the amount of transportation each person needed went up. So it's not just which mode they chose, but the distance between where people live, where they shop, where they work, and where they play was increasing all the time. And the result was transportation need per capita was being driven up by policy choices, and which mode that would be in was driven by policy choices. That's energy, because that's energy consumption. Another part of energy consumption, Peter already mentioned the fact that cities were electrifying pretty quickly. So as an equity matter, the first federal involvement directly in the energy grid was rural electrification. Again, collecting money from where the economic activity was going on at the highest rates in cities and spending it to build infrastructure in unsettled places, rural electrification, which meant if you moved out of a city, you escaped the surplus taxation that was going on in cities, and you got to move to a place where the federal government would build your infrastructure for you, not just transportation infrastructure, but electric distribution networks and generation in some cases. I could keep going. There's some other examples, but in a limited amount of time, I want to shift to the present and look at what are we doing now 100 years later? Well, all those policies I just described that emerged in the 20s and 30s, they are mostly still in place. We perpetuated that set of patterns. We continue to invest in infrastructure outside of cities with monies collected inside of cities. But we now have a new failure of the status quo, one that requires us to make changes. It's no longer just those three crises that I talked about from before. We now are fully aware of this climate crisis. So a new infrastructure plan needs to change the status quo with regards to those three, with an eye towards solving this climate crisis that we're in. So is this current infrastructure plan what we need for that? Still to be determined, but I'm cynical. And the reason why I'm cynical is, yes, there's some headline categories, as Bill showed in those introductory slides, where it looks like money is in places that will help us with this. But it's not just about the headline numbers, it's about exactly how the money will be spent. Let's take transportation projects for a minute. I see that 2-minute warning. Okay, I'll go quickly here. The formula for how the money is distributed. We currently distribute money in 3 different ways: to the states by formula, to specific projects scored by merit, and also to specific projects in order to buy certain legislators' approval, to get the legislation, the bill enacted as an act. And let me talk about the formula to the states and the scoring. The formula to the states is, as our entire governmental system is in the US, weighted towards less pop because of the Senate. Wyoming has as much power in the Senate as New York, and that's built into the funding formula. So we again will be distributing transportation funds to less populated places per capita at a much higher rate than populated places. So we're perpetuating that problem there. Let me talk about the scoring. By the way, that pattern is reproduced in many states when they take the state money and redistribute it to municipalities. Again, cities tend to get screwed. The scoring, what are the criteria? And because I'm running out of time, I'm going to give you examples of criteria we should be using, and we don't know yet whether we will be. Things like, are we scoring based on, do we add value if there are sidewalks for every road through an area above a certain density? Are we offering either scoring bonuses or funding bonuses for bike lanes whenever there's a repaving project? Are we offering any kind of zoning, any kind of bonuses in terms of funding, either the scoring or the amount of money awarded if a community eliminates exclusionary zoning or adds inclusionary zoning or increases density near transit or pays attention to pervious pavement in parking areas or additional street trees. I saw that was one of the questions in the Q&A. What we could accomplish if we either require or force or incentivize street trees for all these paving projects. How do we weigh in the questions of equity along racial lines, along income lines, and along historic lines of communities that were damaged by the previous infrastructure? All of these can be in the scoring for how we choose which projects to fund and how much funding to give them. But it's not clear that we're going to change the status quo enough to do those things. So I think we are at a crossroads, and the jury's still out as to whether or not this is the moment when we're going to do what we need to do. But I think Bill and Peter, that are experts in this, can tell us we can't afford to wait very many more years before we get this right. So with that,
Great.
I'll throw it back to you.
Great. That's a great way to sort of kind of enter into the next phase of the conversation here. You know, this issue of, you know, I mean, what I took from what you've just said, Owen, of course, is that, you know, we built up this sort of policy infrastructure, you know, in the 20s and 30s, and obviously FDR's legacy is kind of embedded in that as part of the New Deal. I don't want to conflate too much too fast, but it certainly is in there. And I hear, like, you know, there are so many, and we've all heard from, you know, from Peter and Bipasha, this question of the limits to sort of rapid change. And in fact, you know, you just ended, Owen, on your point, you know, how can we do this so quickly, you know, in this decade? I guess what I want to turn back to you guys to sort of reflect on before we go into some of the questions, and just to give you a little taste of one of the questions is going to be, you know, can we actually get, like, the NDC that Biden will announce tomorrow is probably going to be, you know, sort of cutting emissions approximately, the question addresses approximately a 50% cut in emissions over the period from 2005 to 2030. So to sort of reduce, you know, that profile up through 2030. And of course, the idea of getting towards zero emissions in mid-century is sort of the goal. So the question back to the panel, you know, what are the tools, what are the capacities to do this rapid change now? And I want to thread in there one last thing. How do we do it in a way that addresses the issue of equity, so there aren't these sort of huge winners and losers, or will there be? And that's an artifact of the moment. So I'll throw it back to the panel and let you guys sort of, you know, reflect on that and answer as you like.
Right. So I can actually talk about, you know, the question that you asked about, you know, the sectors who will be hit and, you know, left behind or needs to be on board, etc. Can I quick again? I would, because I had that in mind to speak about, and I would like to do that because that's one of the area where all over the world we see that there is huge demand from the governments for support to those sectors which are going to make that big jump, where a lot of people work. And we need mandatory climate risk related disclosure by those sectors as to, you know, what is the risk that they are posing towards the environment. And that has to come through regulation in the US as well. But what the private sector is saying, that they also need clarity from the Biden government that climate disclosure will not be met with litigation and regulatory scrutiny, which is a big issue in the US when companies and industries and sectors try to climate align, their supply chain sues them many times because they're disclosing information about many parties. The most important thing here is they are asking for the US government to set a clear taxonomy, exactly what Owen was talking about, a clear taxonomy about which projects are truly aligned with the Paris Agreement or truly climate aligned infrastructure projects and which are not. Now, I would like to say that only today, just before Leadership Summit, EU has published their taxonomy about what they are going to promote to their private sector as being green and not green, and these are the categories. I would like to actually talk about very quickly, with time is constrained, the last one, which are the sectors which will get stranded, which needs to be decommissioned, such as the coal sector. Now, in the US, there is a demand from the coal sector to help them out in this transition, because large number of people work in that sector. And I would quickly like to show you a case study of what Colorado is trying to do. Even in 2020, amidst pandemic, in 2019, the bill that they had passed, HB 19-1314, which is about a bill that helps in a just transition from the coal-based electricity energy economy. And they had laid out this bill, which will help individual workers with the transition, which will train people working in the coal sector to work in other cleaner sectors, which will offer temporary income and benefit assistance, which will align state programs with their need. Most importantly, which will establish a statewide investment fund focused on making investment in coal transition communities. Now, where does that money come? I attended one of the meetings just a few weeks ago with the Colorado local government people, and they were saying that there isn't that money there to have this plan played out. And they are looking for, again, the private sector to help with that transition. How? By able to raise fund through something called a very innovative mechanism called transition bonds, whereby in China, they're trying to do the same to raise funds to help the transition in a just way where workers are not impacted. So I wanted to say that that demand is there from the US government to actually, establish a taxonomy as to what is green, what is transition, and where and how those funds should go. I just gave the Colorado example to show what they're trying to achieve.
Great. Thank you. Maybe Owen, Peter, if you want to pick up the points on like creating new mechanisms to affect greater and more rapid change.
Well, I think that we have to be willing to engage in the substantive conversation about changing processes and changing institutions. We can't keep the same processes and same institutions and expect different outcomes. So if we want different outcomes, we have to be willing to engage in change. And we maybe are at a moment where we can. But I will say one part of that has to be, it's a false debate over whether should it be done by government or should it be done by deregulation and let the private sector do it. We need to do both. We need direct investment from the public sector, and we also need a properly motivated and incentivized private sector. And the reason why I say motivated and incentivized is because I think it's not enough just for there to be disclosures of whether something is brown or green. We need the detailed taxonomy, and there needs to be teeth behind it, where when you do good things, if you're a self-interested corporate actor, there's an incentive. And when you do bad things, there are consequences. For too long, there have been no consequences for doing the environmentally bad thing. And there have been inadequate rewards for doing the green thing. And so we need to do both of those, the direct investment piece and the strong incentives and disincentives. And then we might get some speed going on.
Yes, can I also add that specific measure that you're talking about? Apart from that, I do think that a social cost of carbon has to be established in the US market to ensure that the polluting sector gets financially penalized when they are still polluting. So that bit yet has to come out, where the social cost of carbon, which it'll include the cost of externality, and the price of that will be pretty high.
Great. Well, not great, but challenging. Peter. You.
Thanks, Bill. I don't see, well, first of all, I don't see any disagreement between the things that Owen said and that I suggested. I think that we're on the same page. I think perhaps the emphasis on policy, whether that's the way to go or not, we can debate that. Okay, one of the questions that I'd like to look at is whether let's say Biden comes out with 50%, and I think Professor Carapin asked this, by 2030, 50% drop in the 205 from 205 levels to 2030. Is that possible? And I think that's an interesting way to look at the transition. And I would say that, of course, we don't know, but I would say it would be difficult. Why is that? Well, if you look at sort of trends right now, there has been a drop since 205. And largely that occurred because of the economic recession, the housing debacle that happened, the primary secondary mortgage issue, where we went into a recession. And what happens when recessions occur is that there's less economic activity, there was less energy use, less greenhouse gas emissions. However, other things occurred during that period. There was a restructuring of the energy system. And we all know these because of technologies, things like horizontal drilling, fracking, and the increase of natural gas into our system. Natural gas is now much more competitive than coal. So the level of coal dropped, has been dropping, or was dropping, but it dropped precipitously subsequently. And natural gas has, come on the scene. Most recently, the introduction to the renewables in many of the red states. I mean, where there's wind, et cetera, and solar, et cetera. So these now play a significant role in electricity production in places like Texas and Iowa and these other places. So what had happened is that our energy use per capita, as well as our emissions, has dropped because of those things. Natural gas is much more energy dense than coal, so you get a lot more sort of bang for the buck, in terms, and from utilities. And utilities are now thinking like, well, why am I going to build a coal power plant? Because it's expensive and coal's going out. We have so much gas, so that, that's what they're putting money into. There was never, ever a war on coal from the government. It was in the marketplace that the war was occurring. Okay, can that continue? Can we, see continual drops? It's going to be hard, I think. One of the big issues is that when people talk about energy freedom, in the U.S., they're not really talking about just energy. They're talking about oil, right? Because oil goes into cars, and that's where we do a lot of import. So, and I think another one of our colleagues raised this question, is like, is it possible to electrify, our entire, car sector? It's going to take a while. It's going to take a while. That's going to be a huge, sort of difficult jump to make. Certainly, it can happen. Tesla has demonstrated that there is a market for it, but that market is the very top market, like people that have lots and lots of money to spend. Interestingly, during the pandemic, so the expensive car market was really boomed because people had all this money and they didn't know where to put it, so they bought Ferraris and these type of cars. I mean, and that's, I think, is a fact. And that's what we tend to see in the electric car sector. Bringing that down so that people like myself can buy an electric car and use it is going to be, there's still a lot more work to do there. And finally, a lot of the and Bill can talk about this. A lot of the modeling for bringing carbon down has to do with the using some technologies like carbon capture and storage, which in parts are well-known technologies, in other parts are not so well known. So scaling up some of that stuff remains a challenge and unclear as to whether that's going to happen. Now, before I'm done, I want to look back at history again. If you look back to sort of sort of economic shocks and how they affected energy use, you could see that, for example, the Great Depression and what happened in the 70s, you'll see that energy always dipped, right? But somewhere between 12 and 14 years later, we came back to what's called the rebound effect, and we came back to levels that we had reached in the previous peak. Now, we'll have to see in 12 years from 2007, we're at, to 2019 then, 12 to 14 years, will we come back to those levels, or has there been a real substantial restructuring of our energy system that demonstrates we can do this long term? That's yet to be seen. So I'll just stop there with a not so optimistic future.
Well, I mean, you guys sort of bring up, I mean, really what you're saying is we need to, reform or transform the energy sector, the regulatory sector, and the financial sector simultaneously. I mean, is that a fair assessment of the multiple challenges? And it goes to this question about like what is needed beyond these executive orders and the infrastructure plan to get to the goals that Biden will probably address tomorrow. Owen, to you.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add to that is that we need to not only think in terms of different sectors, but we need to think in terms of different scales. And at the moment, we're talking about a federal initiative, but it's a federal initiative that's implemented at scales. Some of it is implemented at the state level, some of it's implemented at the municipality level. And the regulatory structures also occur at multiple governmental scales. And then there's the need for international cooperation. And I think each one of those levels needs to be both individually active as a governmental entity and also active as a regulator. And we need to be able to do both of those things. And Peter, your point is really well taken. And Bipasha mentioned the social costs of carbon, and you're talking about some of these decisions. For there to be at the corporate level and at the individual level, people have to, if you're going to make a choice, there should be, the consequences of it need to be apparent to you. For the people who have lots of choices, and the people who don't have choice sometimes default to a non-green energy inefficient choice because they don't have a choice, and we can change that too. So we have to think at multiple scales in addition to thinking across sectors, as you were pointing out, Bill.
Right. Yeah, Peter.
I like this idea of the social cost of carbon, and whether what you do with it's going to be important. Is it going to be cap and trade or tax, right? So I think those are the two big choices. But when as an academic we've sort of looked into what this means, this social cost of carbon, and a lot of very smart people have done a lot of work, and it seems to me that how you shift the discount rate, which is one figure, changes the cost dramatically. I think so. So it's not necessarily just an academic scientific model. There's some heavy duty values that go into deciding on what the future is worth. So if you think if the discount rate should be 3% or 5%, or it should be 0.5%, will really change the number.
0.5.
The end up number. Right, 0.5, which is what, so that's what, isn't that what came out of England? Like, it should be very low. And then basically, let's not discount the future at all. Like it's whatever we have now is whatever it's going to be then,
Right.
And which costs get calculated into it also, because it's not, the undercounted cost is often, think about the amount, the military expenditures that have been related to protecting the supply of fossil fuel. And that's never taken into account when we talk about the cost of driving a mile.
Right. Let me sort of kind of grab and pick a little bit from many of the questions. Many of the questions sort of reflect on audience members' sort of particular sort of idea that point that there might be some low hanging fruit or things that, are really significant. There's been a couple of mentions of like, energy use, for the internet, both. I mean, maybe the internet is an example of rapid transition and transformation, but also, for energy use. But then others sort of have talked about, meat production and sort of shifting to, a more vegetarian diet, and the whole meat industry itself is a massive carbon emission. And then another question sort of relates to the issue of should we plant more trees, right? Is that sort of like the way to do it? And I kind of phrase all these things, to put it back to you all. Are there specific kind of avenues and sort of entry points that you think would be particularly valuable for us, given the idea also, to sort of tack on that sometimes we have their false promises or issues that seem good, but in truth don't necessarily get us to the way we want. So natural gas, you've raised this a lot, fracking and other things dramatically increased natural gas production in the United States. Well, what that's done is, of course, locked us in to a type of fossil fuel production, and a lot of people argue we should have been investing in solar and in wind instead of going full. While we see reductions, we can see coal goes down, natural gas goes up, so emissions profile looks good, but in the long term, that sort of locks us in to sort of not really addressing underlying issues. So the question then goes back to, are there these sort of particular entry points that are particularly valuable? And then how do we avoid some of those sort of false promises, those false hopes that sort of come up in a lot of these spaces? Anybody want to pick up on that? I'm trying to capture a lot of the questions. Yeah, Peter.
Well, okay, these are great questions. A couple of things. Number one, as Bill knows very well, the protocols that produce the emissions levels are, again, estimates. If you do have these flares from natural gas, they're not as reductive as they could be, or as they sometimes are calculated. And these are all uncertainties. We just don't know. So, but the argument is that, well, we have all this natural gas now, and it's sort of, creating a certain path for us.
Right, we're locked in pathway dependency.
Yeah, path dependency. I'm one that suggests, that we need a variety of solutions, that there's looking for that silver bullet is a mistake, that it's going to be solutions from all the sectors, from everywhere. Will trees alone, save us? No. Like once you fill up a forest with trees, it's, that's all the sequestration you're going to get, except for, minor additions every year, right? Will renewables save us? I don't believe so. And by the way, renewables have their own issues, which is apparently sort of emerging now. Where do you put them, right? What's happening in some states is that you're having these large renewable utilities moving into sort of rural areas where people don't really want them, but they're sort of, they're emerging because landowners would, either sell or rent their land for that. And there's this equity issue there, upstate, downstate, in places like New York and Massachusetts and Maine, where they're claiming, the people in rural areas are saying, we're being taken advantage of because that energy is not coming to us anyway, it's going to the city. So, I mean, so none of these by themselves will, I don't think, solve everything. I am for sort of, when it comes to technologies, a vast array of them have to be implemented, and it's not going to be easy. It's going to be very complex. And in terms of government policies, I believe in performance standards, which I think work, whether it's for appliances or cars or fuels or whatever. I believe in economic signals, that the government gives economic signals, as long as that government continues that signal, because firms really want long-term consistency, and they want to, they want to know what they have to build out, even 5 and 10, 15 years from now, and they have to put, money into R&D. I see some of this in the Biden plan. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but at my analytic sort of academic side is more less so.
Yeah, Owen.
I think I agree a lot with what Peter's saying, is that none of these single things are the solution, but all of them can be part of a solution. There are questions in the Q&A about, as you said, about meat. Yes, that's an extraordinarily energy intensive and methane producing, especially beef. And so if people eat less meat, will it make a difference? Yes. More street trees, more trees in less clear-cut places, all those things, will they make a difference? Yes. I think there's one interesting thing to think about in terms of low-hanging fruit. One of the questions posted was the pace at which electric cars are being adopted in Europe compared to the US. That's partially because the fuel tax is higher in Europe, so there's a stronger incentive to adopt the electric cars sooner. But that is in some ways a low-hanging fruit, and it's a little distressing when we see this embrace of General Motors and Ford making their announcements about converting to all electric vehicles, because that just changes which type of car, but we really need to consume less energy per person, and we do that by needing to drive less. And we still have traffic jams, and in fact, if an electric car costs less to operate per mile, then we will have more traffic jams. So the idea of we need some of the low-hanging fruit might produce longer-term problems, which Peter was hinting at with renewables. We need to model these things and be wary of the easy solutions, because this is messy and complex, and anything that looks easy, you have to look under the hood, so to speak.
Yeah, I want to just add to that is that I agree with both of you that all the technologies that can be used should be used. However, we need to use science in setting the criteria for having a very federal state level. Again, I keep using the word taxonomy, it could be some other word for the US, categorizing what kind of technologies contribute how much towards the Paris Agreement or the targets that US is setting for 2050 in achieving net zero. And that will generally create not just incentive, but as you were pointing out, Owen, disincentive for those who are investing in technologies that don't fit into those kind of taxonomies. And those taxonomies take time. They need the academic sector, the scientific sector, all to develop metrics and criteria based on which you say, well, hydrogen is green. What does green hydrogen mean? Does it mean 100% renewable energy that creates hydrogen energy, hydrogen-based energy, or other kinds of renewable energies, which are going to be important for what? So I'll give you one example, just how taxonomy is important. If let's take biofuel. Biofuel is considered as not so green for many sectors right now in many countries and under many taxonomies. However, only in the aviation sector, we are unable to find any other way to reduce emission except for using biofuels, which are lower emission than the fossil fuel that the aviation sector uses, because currently we don't have any other technology. So for an interim period, we need to then have some technologies available for some sectors which are, which have no zero path. Whereas in shipping, we do have innovations where we need to put in more money, where you can move away from fossil fuel. So what I'm trying to say, while we need all technologies, but we need to be very specific as to which technology must not be used for many sectors and should be used only for sectors where there aren't any other options probably left. So the taxonomy is extremely important at a federal level. That's my last point.
Great, thank you. We're sort of closing on the time, and I want to sort of give each panelist a moment to sort of reflect. We're literally at the dawn of this sort of moment. Tomorrow will be a huge day in terms of the climate agenda of the Biden administration. So I want to give you each just 30 seconds to sort of say, if you were being asked by Biden, what is one thing that you would focus on in sort of the implementation of this policy based on your expertise? I know that's a lot. I know there's you could sit for hours response, but what's the one thing that you would say? The elevator pitch. You-
I've been thinking about that. I'll jump in here. And
And
I'll
I will interrupt you guys, but it's really just 30 seconds because we want to end on the half hour. Yep.
look at every single line of that infrastructure bill as you presented it, Bill Selecki. And every single one of those lines should have environmental sustainability criteria for how that money is awarded and distributed. That's my elevator speech to Joe Biden.
That's excellent. Bipasha, Peter, any?
I actually was, when you stole my thunder, I was going to say, I was going to say that in different words, though, that we need to use scientific criteria to say what kind of infrastructure commits towards our climate aligned goals. And that is the must. That's the first step that Biden has to take in using scientific criteria to say these are the kind of infrastructure projects that we are going to invest, and this is where we are going to decommission infrastructure investment.
Perfect. The transition from what we have to sort of, and you mentioned stranded assets as an example.
Yes.
Peter. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute. This is your moment, Peter. You
I'm
got to be
sorry.
off mute.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, well, I have two things to say. First, let me answer your question. I would suggest that what Biden and his sort of each of the secretariats, et cetera, need to think about is a much more systemic approach to implementing the infrastructure. In other words, the connection between cities and their hinterlands. I mean, you can't just, and I think Owen sort of mentioned this, just give money to a rural area versus give money to a city. They have to, we have to think about it and how they're connected and why. That's the first thing I wanted to say. And the second thing has to do with just a general announcement. And I just wanted to congratulate Bill Selecki, because I don't even know if he knows this. I think yesterday or the day before, Reuters came out with the top 1,000 most influential climate scientists in the world, and Bill Selecki is on that list. So
No.
congratulations. Yes, you are. Congratulations, Bill.
All right. Well, I guess that bribe paid off. No, I mean, that's a high honor, but I'll have to find that. I had no idea.
I'll send you the link.
That's amazing. All right. Thank you. Well, that's an interesting way that got my mind spinning, but I want to thank, first of all, the panelists again, to bringing light to such an amazingly complex and exciting moment. And I think for the students who are listening, as I've always said to my students, I mean, you are living in one of the most interesting sort of moments with respect to policy, to climate policy, obviously more specifically. We heard the types of transitions and transformations that will be necessary. And I think we're all, attempting, to build that future collectively and to see it unfold in front of us and be active players. So hopefully the panelists gave you that information to sort of, take charge of your future. And I want to again thank Roosevelt House for sort of organizing and sort of bringing this together. I don't know if anybody has any other closing thought or reflection. I mean, we will see what will evolve at tomorrow's Leader Summit that the Biden administration will hold and how things play out over the next several months. But I think we would all agree to sort of stay tuned and just be engaged and be part of this process, because it is very vital to us all. So thank you so much. I think I'll close it down. And Peter Scafani, I'll bring it back to you to sort of close it down as appropriate. But thank you all for the questions and the participation.
Thank you.
Thanks for coordinating us, Bill. You brought us all together and made this work. I appreciate that.
It was fun. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. Peter, are we still live?
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you to all our panelists for being here as well. And please join us on April 23rd for the Public Humanities and Democratic Commons Conference presents Reckoning with Monuments and Public Commemoration. Thank you again, everybody, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody, we're still here, but I'm gonna just close it out. I turned my camera off before, and now I don't have another one. So
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. It was great. I really appreciate you guys coming together for this.
Yeah, I think Pasha's already taken off, but thanks so much, guys. You really, I mean, it's really nice. It was just so fun to like just hold on and hear you guys talk. I apologize for one, having my computer crash, and two, talking a little bit long at the intro, but I thought it maybe in retrospect gave a lot of like the background stuff that you guys didn't have to handle.
I thought it was very well set up, and I thought it was a good conversation.
Yeah, great. All right, well, we'll see what happens tomorrow with the, be very interesting with the NDC releases and so forth. I know Peter's probably going to stay up all night, sort of watching the releases come in.
All right, Bill, there's the URL.
Oh, I'll look at this. This is so funny. God, that is bizarre. I don't know how the hell that happened. Anyway.
Peter, we'll have to get you on the next version of that.
Yeah.
No,
That's crazy.
We still have, by the way,
I hope I didn't embarrass you, Bill, by
20
mentioning it.
No, it's fine, but it's just I was kind of taken aback, but now I'm anxious, of course, to see where I am and who's ahead of me.
I forgot. Yeah. All right.
Have you look forward to the next time I get a chance to work with you. I always enjoy it.
Yeah.
It's
Okay,
fun.
everyone.
Thank you so much, Owen.
was
Thanks.
great.
Thanks. Take care. Hey, Pete.